So, hello, my name is Vasilios Kosmakos. Today is March 8th, 2022. Who do I have the pleasure of speaking with today?
Dr. Jason Spadaro.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm Dr. Spadaro. So first off, if you can just tell me what you do, and if you can just tell me a little bit about your background. So how did you get to where you are?
So I did a PhD in ecological sciences at Old Dominion University and focused on the role of invertebrate grazers in driving coral reef community assemblages and specifically restoration. I then worked briefly for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, their research institute in Marathon, working on lobsters. And then I was a assistant professor of marine science and technology at the College of the Florida Keys for several years. And then I just recently accepted a position here at Mote Marine Lab managing the coral restoration program.
So if you can just tell me specifically a little bit about your research interests, right? So what exactly do you research on and why is that important?
So I use, broadly, we're interested in restoring function and form to Florida's coral reefs and reefs throughout the Caribbean region. Very specifically, I tend to focus on the role of invertebrate grazers in facilitating active coral restoration programs. So we're very good at producing and outplanting coral fragments, but then there's a whole suite of other stressors that those corals actually encounter over the next, 3, 5, 10 years before they're integrating into that coral community. I use invertebrate grazers, namely a large spider crab, to actually manipulate their density on a reef. They consume noxious and chemically defended algae that compete with corals on the reef and thus release those corals from those coral algal interactions and leads to higher growth rates and we hope a more rapid entry into the reproductive community on the reef.
And the specific species of spider crab you're studying is what?
Is Magwamithrax spinocismus. So it's the Caribbean king crab.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So kind of describe why that's important, right? So corals obviously undergo a lot of different stressors because of climate change and everything else, right?
Correct.
But with a lot of the nutrient runoff, right, we're seeing increasing algae blooms over the last several years. So how does algae compete with corals for space and that type of stuff?
Oh, I'd argue that it's more than just the last few years. Yeah, so probably the last century. We've been dealing with coastal eutrophication or coastal nutrification and the effects of that. Algae in particular compete with coral directly for space, right? So algae, fleshy, upright macroalgae can actually grow over corals and smother them and kill them.
Oh, wow.
But there's also a more insidious interaction between the two where algae, when they get established on a reef and they go through succession, just like a field of grass can succeed through to an old growth forest through time. Same thing happens in the ocean, but it's much, much, much tighter time scale, right? So we're talking about on the order of months or maybe a year as opposed to decades or centuries in a terrestrial system. Once those algae get into those later successional stages, they stop growing, right? So they're not using those nutrients in the water anymore because there's so much biomass that they've stripped it out of the water column. But photosynthesis continues, right? They're essentially a solar panel. They can't stop that photoreactive, or that photoreaction. Which means that as long as there's water and carbon dioxide, they are producing glucose, sugar. They can't use it if they're not bringing in more nitrogen and phosphorus. So instead of breaking down those sugar molecules, which is really energetically expensive, they'll take and they'll dump that sugar into the water column, which means that there's a lot of dissolved organic carbon, right? Carbon is the most abundant component of sugars. Carbon is the limiting factor, so nitrogen and phosphorus are kind of the limiting factor in algal growth, but carbon is really that limiting nutrient for microbial communities. So as you get really abundant algal communities, they start dumping dissolved organic carbon, which means that all microbial critters on the reef get this fertilizer and they boom. And that includes potentially pathogenic microbes, which can lead to coral disease, which leads to corals dying off, which opens up more space for algae, which leads to more dissolved organic carbon, which leads to further things. So it's this kind of cyclic negative feedback. What most people kind of put algae into this, they're good or they're bad, right? And they're neither of those things. They're just part of the community, right? When they get abundant and into those late successional stages, they can have some very dramatic negative effects on coral reefs. But if you didn't have algae at all, you wouldn't have the biodiversity that we have on coral reefs. They are the solar panels. They're the way that we transmit solar energy into higher trophic levels on coral reefs. So my goal is to get grazing intensity so high that you actually knock back algal communities into that early successional stage, kind of turfs, a grazed turf, where they are hyper productive, incredibly productive, but the biomass is very low. So you have very, very little algae on the reef, but it's producing, a number of grams of carbon per square meter per year is through the roof. And that means that all of that energy that they're capturing from the sun, they're growing and producing, is being eaten by herbivores, which are then eaten by primary consumers, and so on and so on and so on. So you actually take all of that solar energy and all those nutrients that we're worried about, put them into biomass and entrap them in this hyper biodiverse system on the reef.
And then I would imagine, because this, algae is essentially kind of has a lot more nutrients, right? Because it's so hyper productive, right?
Yeah.
It's going to increase fish size and invertebrate size and kind of just greater. It's going to make the reef healthier, essentially, right?
Yes, absolutely. It depends on what's going on with the rest of the, kind of that finfish community, whether you're going to start seeing fish of larger sizes, right? So out in the Indo-Pacific, way out in the Pacific Islands, it's either Kingman, the Line Islands are one of these systems where you have an inverted trophic pyramid, right? So sharks sharks and large apex predators account for the vast majority of the biomass in that system, which means that herbivores are actually, there's lots of them, but they're actually really small because there's such high turnover, right? So that's really a system that would be about as close to pristine as you can get. So in that system, yes, you have much more productivity. You have very little standing biomass of algae, but its productivity is through the roof. And herbivores are eating it and keeping it very nutritionally complex and transmitting that energy up. But then the primary consumers are eating all the herbivores, so they tend to be small, but because there's a high turnover and so on and so on. So it's not exactly what you would think. But in a system like this, where we have relatively few apex predators, and we're in a continental system, so we're not an insular reef, you might absolutely see larger fishes in those first few trophic categories with this algal community that we're talking about.
So kind of just like you were saying, right? A kind of pristine ecosystem has a large predatory kind of presence, right, which kind of keeps the herbaceous kind of species down, right? It's like kind of this inverted pyramid, right? Do you think are the Florida Keys naturally kind of the way you described, as in there's just not a lot of predators naturally here to begin with, or is that because of anthropogenic influence? So
are we seeing what we see because of a shifting baseline?
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe. I mean, if you look back at Columbus and reports of that time period, you could walk across the backs of fishes, and things like that. So yes, it's entirely possible that before the Industrial Revolution and before the introduction of Western, kind of mechanized fishing and everything, that we may have had something akin to an inverted trophic pyramid. but it's been so long since we've had that, and it would take so long to actually recover to that kind of community that what is natural at this point? Are we going to see a shift back? Could we literally restore the community to that scope? Probably not. But we can try to mimic that kind of function in driving recovery.
By mitigating algae growth on the bottom, which kind of, like you're saying,
among many other things. Yeah, I mean that's one component of a very complex restoration plan. So I'm not saying that herbivores are the answer. They're one part of the answer.
Interesting. So kind of discuss kind of the role of invertebrates on the reef, right? So why are invertebrates important, and then how does that kind of lead to larger fish populations, and how do invertebrates kind of mitigate algae growth? So if that makes any sense.
Why are invertebrates important?
Yeah,
they account for the vast majority of the biodiversity out there, right? I mean, there's very few things with a backbone, and they're just, objectively more interesting. So, they come in all shapes and sizes. It's not really a taxonomic group, right? Like, it's not a biological division. It's just an artificial construct that we've put together to describe stuff that doesn't have a backbone. So they fill every functional role on the reef, from, literally corals to lobsters and nudibranchs and, all kinds of different things. All of those invertebrates serve some functional role. They contribute to the extreme biodiversity on the reef. And I would argue that the vast majority of the life on a coral reef, any coral reef around the world, is invertebrates. The vast majority. And here we've focused on a couple of very, very functionally important invertebrates like urchins and these crabs and many other species that contribute to this grazing intensity that we're trying to manipulate or recover to kind of tip those scales back in favor of these corals that we're outplanting, or, kind of facilitate their growth, survival, eventual recruitment into the community, and then, ideally their entry into that reproductive population of corals on the reef.
So what species of coral are you specifically trying to promote?
Yes.
Yeah.
We're working very, very hard. We specifically work with Acropora cervicornis and Acropora palmata, the two branching species of critically endangered corals. But then we also work with Orbicella faviolata, Orbicella annularis, Pseudodiploria clivo, all of those massive form corals that are slower growing, a little harder to propagate, and a little harder to get reestablished, but that are infinitely more in trouble. They need much more help recovering on the reef than things like Acropora cervicornis and Acropora palmata, which are weeds, right? So we've got their propagation and outplanting down pat. It's something that's done all over the Caribbean and really acroporids all over the world. But they're fast growing, they're weedy, they breed like rabbits, so we've got lots and lots of information on them. We know much less about how to restore massive form corals on a landscape scale. So that's one of the things that we're working very hard on here at Mote, and throughout the Florida Keys is to restore that reef building massive form coral community that is so critical to saving the actual geological structure or biogenic structure of the reef.
And this massive form coral community, right? Is it stuff like brain coral?
Mm-hmm. Brain corals, star corals,
these just larger,
all of those. Yeah, the kind of mounding, massive form, boulder brain corals. A number of those species, and we've got at least 5 or 6 of them on campus here. Probably more than that. I'm speaking out of turn. I'm sure that the inventory has more than 5 or 6 of those species on campus here, but we've got at least several of those in large scale production here and in the offshore nursery.
So what makes Mote's kind of coral restoration efforts unique? Because, there's coral, the same process of growing coral is done around the world in Australia and everywhere else, right? But
yeah.
Is there anything that Mote is doing particularly that's unique as opposed to what everybody else is doing?
Well, I think it's unique in that we are a practitioner in the fact that we put out corals literally for restoration purposes, but we are also a research laboratory. So everything that we do has a purpose in terms of driving science forward. We integrate sexual reproduction and resilience testing and genetics and disease incidents and all of these things into a holistic science-based coral restoration plan. So really, I think that is what sets Mote apart from many restoration practitioners and people that are engaged in propagating and outplanting corals, is that everything that we do is driven by and contributes to science.
Interesting. Yeah. So let's kind of circle back to water quality, right? So you're kind of mentioning a lot of these different algae, right? It's like, is there any, algae is kind of a big term, right? So is there are there any specific algae that are more of a problem than others? So blue algae, sargassum, red algae. I mean, what is really kind of the main kind of enemy here, so to speak?
Yeah, there are a few that are particularly noxious, like sargassum or dictyota, where they're incorporating a lot of secondary metabolites into their tissues that actually deter many herbivores, which is one of the reasons that the crabs are so interesting, because they eat everything. Wow. Then you also have other things like halimeda and amphiroa and a couple of others that incorporate a lot of calcium carbonate into their tissues, just like corals. And that makes them unpalatable because you're chewing on sand. And they've also got some, secondary metabolites that discourage grazers from browsing on them. I would say it's really not, any of those at low abundance aren't really a big problem. They're natural components of the ecosystem. It's when they get really, really abundant. And for a long time, they start accumulating detritus, and you get kind of oxygen minimal zones inside of them. They alter the flow regime over reefs. They can deter herbivores from large swaths of the reef, and because they're so noxious and everything, they actually exude a whole bunch of chemical cues that can deter coral larvae from settling, chemically, but also physically, right? They're taking up that space, so corals can't. And then they can actually, physically and chemically, go to war with corals that they, literally overgrow and kill. And then that whole disease, dissolved organic carbon algae microbes kind of model that we talked about earlier.
So sargassum seems to be specifically kind of a large issue in the Florida Keys.
Oh yeah, yeah.
From my understanding, it comes from Africa to a certain degree, right? Or
from the Sargasso Sea,
yeah.
I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So kind of describe tell us a little bit about sargassum, kind of how it gets here, how it's growing, kind of the history of it, that type of thing.
Right. Well, so that's I think you're going to find as you go around Florida a whole bunch of disparate opinions about sargassum. Essentially, it's really less of a problem here in Florida than it is further south in the Caribbean, where I've got colleagues who have racks, in Belize and Mexico and even further south in Honduras and Guatemala, where they have that buildup of sargassum on the beach that can be 10 meters deep, and meters and meters and meters out. I mean, just tons, literally, of algae on the beach. And one of the things that you don't think about, it's gross and it smells bad and all that kind of stuff, but when you have an enormous volume of that, we've gotten really surprising reports that a lot of hydrogen sulfide will get into the air and just destroy electronics. So down there in many of those places, they don't have windows like we do. They have, louvers and screens, and that hydrogen sulfide gets into electronics, and they'll have cameras and computers and TVs and all that kind of stuff just destroyed for, hundreds of meters inland. So it can be a direct economic and electronic menace. A lot of places, especially down here in Key West, I think there's a group with IFAS who's trying to look at, can we compost sargassum and use it as a terrestrial fertilizer? I've heard of another group that's trying to extract the cellulose from it and create, I think it was biodegradable plastic kind of materials. Another group was trying to find a way to eat it, which I don't know if you've ever tasted a chemically defended seaweed. They're very good at defending stuff from eating them. But here in Florida, I think it's really more of a nuisance, especially once you get offshore. If you get the trade winds and they blow all of that stuff into lines, it can actually be a real big benefit. It's one of the only sources of structure out in the open ocean, off of the reef, for pelagic fishes. So it's fishermen love it, right? Especially when there's lots of it. You get these long, miles and miles long lines of seaweed that you can troll your baits past and pick up things like Coraphina hypris, or mahi-mahi, tuna, swordfish, wahoo, things like that. So all those pelagic game fishes really gravitate to it because it's the structure that they're adapted to use. When it gets overly abundant, when we have huge racks of it coming in, it can actually impede navigation out there. I mean, it can literally get so large that it binds up in the prop, and you end up having to kind of stop every few feet and get it out of the prop, and then move a little further and get it out, which is kind of a pain in the butt. Down further south in the Caribbean, it can literally shut down navigation. It can be so thick and so abundant that it can preclude using a vessel in certain bodies of water.
So you mentioned that algae is a result of a lot of nutrients, right?
Sure.
So in the case of sargassum, right, it's like some of it might come from the Sargasso Sea, but a lot of the other algae, that exists in Florida Keys probably is the result of a lot of nutrient kind of runoff, right? As we're
sure.
So kind of describe how those nutrients are getting into the Florida Keys. Is that a result of the Everglades? Is that a result of
all of the above?
Yeah.
So we definitely have land-based sources of pollution and runoff and anthropogenic sources of nutrient enrichment. Excuse me. So things like here locally, we just recently, in the last few years, switched from septic systems over to sewer. All of that infrastructure wasn't necessarily removed, and then we had a major hurricane that inundated the entire island chain. So all of that stuff that was in those septic drain fields was liberated and put into nearshore waters. Yeah, and it was disgusting. But we also have things like the typical sources of runoff. Fertilizers, lawns, agriculture up further north. There is that whole Lake Okeechobee and watershed. So basically all of Orlando and Ocala and everything north drains down through that space and then has to go somewhere. So some of that stuff makes it into the Gulf of Mexico and comes around, and we see it here in the lower Keys eventually. Some of that stuff makes it off into Indian River Lagoon, and we'll maybe see some of it, later on. But we also have kind of natural sources of nutrient enrichment, things like upwelling and wind action, wave action, and if we have seagrass die-offs, that liberates a whole bunch of mineralized nutrients into the water column. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can get that nutrient enrichment. But yes, absolutely, runoff is definitely one of them.
So, I mean, have you seen a connection between kind of the stuff that's been happening like in Okeechobee and Everglades, right? A lot of the kind of, because the Everglades, right, is essentially a big filter, right? Have you seen a connection between the destruction of the Everglades and destruction of Lake Okeechobee and direct increase in algae growth, specifically in the Keys? Is there any way to kind of correlate those two directly?
Probably not.
Okay.
I mean, yes, I'm sure that they have had an effect, but I think that effect, it's not a short term, right?
Yeah.
So in my career is only 11 years old or 12 years old. No, I think that effect is way out back before then. So I think that, yes, we're probably seeing some of the results of quite a bit of that, but I think, no, I haven't seen it enter the system because it was here long before I was. We've definitely seen algae, not really boom, but we've seen a lot of stuff fall in algae's favor, right? So we just had Hurricane Irma, and even before that, we had stony coral tissue loss disease, which ripped through the entire Florida reef tract and liberated a lot of space for algae to take over, and it did very quickly. It hasn't progressed to that late successional stage, really nasty algal community in many places. In some places it absolutely has. But in many places it's not progressing too terribly far. So I wouldn't call our reefs algal dominated, but I mean they are. There's more algae than coral right now, but
There's hope.
yeah, absolutely. It's not an insurmountable problem.
So discuss that a bit more, right? So what are some things that you're seeing that we should be hopeful about, right? So it's like, especially the research you're doing, right? It's like with, us understanding the role of invertebrate species and different ways of mitigating algae growth. What are some things that, we should be looking forward to in a positive sense?
Well, one, restoration. So every step of the way, we are pumping out corals faster and faster, and not just any corals and not just in any fashion. We're doing it in a very systematic and scientifically driven way that it's working. We are having corals survive and fuse and grow larger for 3, 5, 8 years at a time, and we've just had several outplanted corals just around the corner over here that were outplanted as microfragments 5 years ago, or now almost 7 years ago, that fused, grew into a large colony, and then spawned. So that's really the goal of what we're doing. We're not trying to replace all of the coral that goes out onto the reef. We're trying to help those coral communities overcome these Allele effects where, a mommy and a daddy coral are too few and far between for them to naturally recover. So we're putting out colonies in such a way that you overcome those Allele effects and you drive natural forms of recovery like sexual reproduction. And we're very encouraged that we're seeing that. The corals that we're putting back out and that other practitioners are putting out are spawning every year. Now, if we can get them to settle appropriately, which is where algae was really a problem, and one of the things that colleagues and I are working on is outplanting or manipulating the density of benthic invertebrates or herbivores like crabs and urchins. The Florida Aquarium and University of Florida, Dr. Josh Patterson is working on diadema, the long spine sea urchin. Both of those critters can remove algae from the bare reef surface and provide a structure that's appropriate for coral larvae to settle. So we're very encouraged. So the more of these herbivores that we put out, the more appropriate settlement habitat there is. Hopefully the more reproductive coral colonies we get, thus the more gametes, thus the more larvae, and hopefully eventually we see natural recovery start to ramp up pace and help us restore and recover that entire community.
So it's almost like you're giving the coral a jump start, right? So just a little shock, and then it kind of hopefully does what it normally does. Right?
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. Now, I mean, it's not something that we can get to the point where we have reproductive colonies and then stop. So it's a constant battle against the stuff that caused this issue in the first place is still there. Climate change, water quality, anthropogenic impacts, overfishing, all of this stuff is still active in the system. So we are fighting an uphill battle, and so are coral reefs. but we're finding more and more resilient, more and more resistant genotypes of corals, and the more sexual reproduction we conduct, every one of those coral larvae that comes out is a unique recombinant genome, so has a new set of traits. So every one of those coral larvae that we settle and grow out is new hope. You know, that's a new combination of genes, alleles, and traits that might persist through this changing environment that we find ourselves in.
So earlier you kind of mentioned something called, I think, the Allele Facts. Is that correct?
Allele Facts.
Yeah. Can you describe very simply what that is?
So it's basically a density-dependent effect on reproduction. So if you have a species that requires proximity to one another, like corals, where they need to be close to one another, especially broadcast spawners, where you're spitting sperm and eggs up into the water column and hoping that they mix, right? If the male and female, or colony A and colony B, for species that don't have, hermaphrodite species, the further apart they are, the less chance, the less probability that those two sets of gametes are going to meet and mix. So Allele effects are when you have density-dependent issues. They're not close enough or frequent enough for fertilization to be a high probability. And that's what we're dealing with here, where you have, on a landscape scale, large deleterious, instances like stony coral tissue loss disease came through and wiped out a large number of corals. The ones that are left are super resilient, we think, we hope, maybe even disease resistant. These are the corals that are left out there naturally are the ones that have gone through the gamut, right? These are the ones that we really need to pay attention to. The problem is that they're so few and far between that they can't naturally fertilize one another. So we go and, in between these two, you plant several other ones so that you can bridge those gaps, basically increase connectivity among those populations.
Stony coral disease, though, is still raging, though, from my understanding.
It's not quite as active here in the Keys as it was, but it is definitely still there. It has made its way down into the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef, and I think that it's down through Belize now. So it's gone through Mexico and Belize, the Cayman Islands, several other places around the Caribbean. So it's a regional pandemic, and it's definitely one that it's painful to watch, but there are some groups like Dr. Neely and Mote that are working on treatment and really understanding how that pathogen transmits, and quite honestly, what the pathogen or pathogens are. We really don't know for sure what that disease is really caused by. That's a pretty depressing field of study, but it's a very important one.
So circling back a little bit to invertebrates, right?
Yeah.
How do we kind of promote their growth naturally, right? What can the public do to maybe encourage the growth of invertebrates, and to kind of help mitigate this kind of algae issue that we've kind of been speaking about?
Oh, invertebrates?
Yeah.
Oh, they can, support research like what we're doing and what Josh Patterson is doing in the Florida Aquarium, and all those groups. Really, we're much further along right now in coral restoration than we are in Grazers application. So one of the things that they can do is support that kind of research. They can read as much as they can, get into this field and find other Grazers. It's not limited to one or two species. It's a whole function that many different critters play a role in. So just keep supporting it and get into the field and help find some new critters that we can get out there and support or facilitate, and drive that grazing intensity up on coral reefs.
Are there any kind of megafauna that are particularly useful as grazers? So I know I can't really think of any specific fish, right? But
Well, there are parrotfishes.
Yeah.
A whole family of parrotfishes. Although you'll get mixed opinions about them up and down the Keys. Yeah, well, yeah, it's, you know, they eat the coral, and we've seen them eat urchins and crabs and things like that. You know, so they're an interesting group of fishes. But then there's also surgeon fishes like the blue tang, you know, the Atlantic blue tang and doctorfish and the ocean surgeon. All of those critters are more. They're not bioeroders like parrotfish are, but they are going after very specific communities of algae. So it's a team effort of grazers. It's not, you know, one critter is going to, you know, solve the problem. It's really, we need to facilitate a community of grazers that addresses all the different nuances of that algal community. Crabs are one, and they're kind of a generalist herbivore, which is really great. I mean, you know, they'll eat everything and in every successional stage, which is great. But there are some things that they won't do. You know, they'll keep moving on after macroalgae and leave algal turf behind, which means that it's still, you know, it still tends to drive changes or inhibit coral settlement, which is a big sticking point. That's what we need to drive, you know, increases in. Urchins will mow right over turf and some macroalgae, but they can also, they're kind of indiscriminate. So there are some arguments out there that urchins will actually have a deleterious effect on those little coral settlers, where they can mow right over them. It's not like they're targeting coral, but they can inadvertently, you know, get rid of them. I think when we get the system back into a stage where you have an appreciable amount of coral cover and you have a functional coral reef community, all of those issues are going to kind of fall into the background noise. But right now, we're trying to reset that system, and really as much grazing intensity as we can get out there, the better. Combined with putting out corals and putting out reproductive corals and getting appropriate settlement habitat in place. Once we kind of shock that system, or not really shock that system, once we jump that system back onto a trajectory of recovery, a lot of those kind of nuances in the grazing community will be, I think they'll fall off into kind of background noise, natural processes.
So now let's take this issue, right, kind of look at it from more of a macro lens, right? So how does a healthy Florida Keys reef influence and improve the state overall in terms of the kind of surrounding bodies of water, and also how does a healthy Florida Keys reef improve our neighbors, right, our Caribbean islands, our Mexican partners, etc.?
How does a healthy
Florida Keys reef improve the rest of the waters across the rest of the state?
Okay. How does it improve the waters around the state?
Or just like or the habitats, right? So are these corals going into the Gulf of Mexico? Are these corals going up the East Coast, right? I mean, like, what's happening here?
I wouldn't bet that the corals on Florida's coral reef are going into the Gulf of Mexico, although it's entirely possible. There's a little bit of, the Florida Keys are a really interesting hydrodynamic environment, so it's entirely possible, and we do have some reef building corals that do and have existed on the Gulf side of the islands. It's not often, and it's not likely, but moving further up the state on the East Coast, yes, absolutely, we definitely have. I mean, the Florida Reef Tract, or Florida's coral reef, extends all the way up, I believe, to Fort Pierce. Beyond that, no, I doubt. Maybe a few corals here and there, but we really don't have much reef building going on beyond Fort Pierce going north. However, the species that rely on the coral reef as a critical habitat and nursery habitat, and the associated habitats as nursery and critical habitat, yes, absolutely, that affects species on both sides of the islands and all the way up and down the coast. In terms of chemical and biological inputs, yeah, absolutely. The coral reef here captures and entrains nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, nutrients that come into the system. One of the reasons that coral reefs are so effective in supposedly oligotrophic conditions, is that every time they get any kind of nutrient input, they grab onto it and train it in biomass or detritus and transmit it and recycle it very efficiently within that system. So the water that moves past a reef should, in theory, be relatively low in nutrients because everything is pulling stuff out and entraining it, and they're capturing it. So it's not a system that's exporting a lot of excess nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, things like that. So presumably the water that you have moving up the East Coast from coral reef ecosystems should be cleaner than when it started.
So you had mentioned earlier too that you have this disease that's kind of affecting corals, in Florida Keys, and now that's going to spread to Mexico, to Cayman Islands, etc. Right? So the health of our corals here does have kind of international implications, right?
Oh yeah.
So kind of discuss that point a bit more.
Oh, so that could have been, we don't know how it's transmitting among those different places. It could be that it's a waterborne pathogen that's making that long distance travel, or it could be that recreational scuba divers or ballast water in ships, or fish, birds that are dipping into the water here and dipping into the water there are transmitting. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that disease can and might be getting transmitted around the Caribbean, but the first observation of that disease was right here up off of Miami, and it ripped through the Florida Reef Tract in both directions. And then it started popping up in other places around the Caribbean, and surprisingly, it's in places that people like to go to dive. So that's a potential culprit. Water that's left in your buoyancy compensator gets
flushed out,
released. When you go to use it in another location, or any number of different potential vectors. But that's it's a fact of life, especially in a planet that's so connected as this. If you have an environmentally transmitted critter and you have people moving around from place to place, it's absolutely not surprising that this starts popping up in other places.
Describe the connectivity, the biological connectivity between different reefs across this kind of relatively small body of water, right? So it's the Caribbean, right? So imagine I guess that's always going on before, how these different fish species, invertebrate species, etc., how their life stages, how their migratory patterns, right, are kind of relying on these kind of hotspots of different reefs and.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Throughout the entire region, there are source and sink kind of populations based on the hydrodynamics of the region. It's essentially two semi-enclosed basins. You have the Gulf of Mexico up in the north and the Caribbean Sea in the south, and then you have
the Gulf Stream,
a series of standard currents that are running through that whole thing, the loop current, all that kind of stuff. So stuff that happens anywhere in the Caribbean can, given that it's persistent in the water column, affect places all along the entire region. We saw that with the disease that killed most of Diadema antillarum. So it started right near Panama, and within 1 year had spread all over the entire region. And we're fairly certain that was a waterborne disease, and that it follows the current patterns very, very closely.
Wow.
So the things like pollution and diseases and larvae, so things like lobster. Our Caribbean spiny lobster spend 6 to 9 months in the water column as larvae. So the lobsters that we have here in Florida are likely not born here in Florida. They're born in Venezuela and Honduras and Nicaragua and Guatemala, much, much, much further south in the Caribbean. And they ride those currents all the way up until they're post-larvae, and then they swim in from the Gulf Stream and recruit to these nearshore habitats right here. Same thing is true of many different species that have long larval durations.
Which are typically invertebrates, right?
Lots of invertebrates, some fishes, lots and lots of invertebrates have that long, complicated larval development period.
I think it's it's an important point to make, right? Because it's like what happens in Panama or Mexico or what happens in Florida, right? Our pollution strategies, the way we kind of affect these things, do have these kind of broader regional applications that affect the health of, across our ecosystems.
Yeah.
So it's like if we want to talk about using invertebrates to maybe mitigate grazing of algae, it's like we have to understand where these invertebrates are coming from and kind of solve the issue at the source, right? Instead of kind of waiting for them to kind of float around here, right?
Yeah. Well, and I would argue that even more important is what's going on land. Yeah. I just saw a figure the other day of the Mississippi River. What am I trying to say? The watershed of the Mississippi River goes all the way up into Canada. So stuff that's happening up in Canada is affecting us here in the Florida Keys in terms of water quality and pollution and things like that. And those absolutely drive patterns in invertebrate development and connectivity. Land-based sources of pollution and freshwater inputs and changes to those things can change the chemical cues that larvae of invertebrates and vertebrates use to cue into certain habitats. And if you throw off that navigation system that they have, they can end up essentially becoming dissolved organic carbon or settling in habitats that are not appropriate and just being susceptible to very, very high predation rates. So it's absolutely. All those things absolutely control or drive patterns in invertebrate and vertebrate recruitment and survival.
When you mention algae's relationship with dissolved organic carbon, do algae potentially have the ability to cause ocean acidification through the breakdown of it?
No, I would actually argue that they're one of the solutions. So they use carbon dioxide and water to produce sugars, and they don't stop doing that as long as there's light. So they're actually removing CO2 from the water. So algae farming is actually one of the big exciting ways of addressing ocean acidification effects. So no, actually, they're probably one of the things that's reducing the effects of ocean acidification. They can, when they get very abundant, cause all kinds of other problems, which are exacerbated by acidification. But no, I don't think they're going to cause acidification.
I guess like you said earlier, right? It's a balancing act. Too much is bad, too little is worse, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any questions, Adolfo?
Yeah, I have a couple questions. One of the questions, I was thinking about like deep sea mining and also microplastics. Are there any impacts in the corals based off that?
I'm sure there are. I think that there's several studies out there that show that microplastics are absolutely capable of getting into corals. Orally, and I think they just eat stuff that contains microplastics, and it gets incorporated into their tissues and causes some issues there. Deep sea mining, I mean, sure, there's the potential for releasing something that pollutes an upstream, reef. But I just don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Another question that I had, you mentioned harvesting, you guys are able to do that now. At what scale are you able to do it? I mean, we have a lot coral reefs, all over the place in here in this areas. How much effort does that take to get everything done? Like, let's say you're trying to reproduce and harvest in different areas. Do we need to, or combine corals? Well, when you're going out into the
combine their gametes and produce sexual recruits. We're kind of limited in the scope of that, but we're one of many different collaborative partners who engage in that, and most of the time, all of those partners share material from their location. So instead of us trying to put people at in many different places up and down the reef, many different partners are at all of those places, and we share a little bit of what we collect in every one of those places so that everybody gets a diverse genetic assemblage of material to work with. But that scope is all the way from the dry Tortugas up through, at least through Broward and Palm Beach County. And then we've also got other collaborators down throughout the Caribbean who are doing this as well. And there are some ways that we can cryogenically preserve gametes, and I mean for years, and then combine them with gametes from another population, and you get viable larvae. We're not allowed to put those, chimeras back in the water, but we have been exploring those kinds of ways. I mean, these present all kinds of new opportunities or potential tools for recovering after catastrophic events like stony coral tissue loss disease, if we get to that point.
All right. Question, I guess I want to go back a little bit to the beginning. How did you get interested in marine biology, being out here in the oceans and doing the profession that you're currently doing?
Oh, at an early age, I was a Navy brat. So my father was in the Navy. I was born in Spain, and then the first place that we moved, at about a year old, was Key West. So my father was stationed there for 4 or 5 years. And I grew up snorkeling. I learned how to swim right there in Garrison Bight down in Key West. So it's always been, it's one of my first conscious memories is snorkeling on, coral and big fishes here in the Keys. And then, we lived in some other places, Guam, out in the Indo-Pacific and a couple of other places, where I was never further than a few miles from the water my entire life. So it's just kind of been a love affair right from the beginning.
All right. How would you, I guess I'm thinking in the level, like, how can we get more people interested in all this? How can we bring awareness about of everything that's happening? How can they get involved, or what can they do?
I think you're doing it right now. You guys are, awareness, outreach, doing these kind of public spots where you're taking the science that we're doing and the enthusiasm that we have for our work and transmitting it to people that aren't as fortunate as we are to work and live in places like this, and encourage them to take on this field that is very challenging, very frustrating, but also very rewarding at times. And it's not easy whatsoever. And it's not just, jumping in the water and riding flipper out to the reef and restoring the reef. It's a lot of challenges. It's a lot of learning from failure and taking lessons from those things and building a new trial that doesn't fail as much, Yeah. So we're it's science writ large. We're literally building a method to do something that has never been done. So it's people that enjoy getting challenged, people that aren't afraid of failure, people that learn from their mistakes and improve moving forward, would do very well in this field.
Within Mote Laboratory, what are other projects that you guys are currently working on?
Oh my gosh. We have a whole suite of other projects. Actually, Allison downstairs would be a much better person to ask that question to. I know that we're working on Grazers. We're working on just outplanting corals in a science-driven restoration. We're also looking at how do you manage the genetic diversity in an ex situ, a land-based, and an in situ, underwater nursery. Mm-hmm. And then how do you track where all of those different genotypes are going and how how they're responding to different environmental conditions in different places and so on and so on. We're very, very much involved in the sexual reproduction of corals and the sexual production of corals, both here on land and out on the reef. Mote this just in this facility, we really focus on coral reef restoration and research. But Mote has programs that span from education to sea turtles to deep sea stuff, sharks, to ocean technology to sharks. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the answer to that question is yes.
Right.
What are we doing? Yes.
Thank you.
So, in your own way, how do you define conservation and how do you define sustainability? Those are pretty loaded words, right? They're almost overused nowadays, but yeah, I kind of find that everybody kind of has a different way of interpreting them. So, how do you interpret those two words?
I would say conservation is the protection of, the protection of what we have. We want to engage in management in a way that we not so much preserve but conserve what's there. Sustainability is really just operating in a fashion that can be sustained through multiple generations. So if we're talking about sustainable development, you must be able to continue development at that rate for multiple generations without exhausting materials and space and things for the next generation or the next generation or the next generation. Same thing with fisheries. Sustainable fisheries need to be at a level and scope that is able to be maintained for multiple generations. So if we don't want to be fishing out all the material for our children's children, and it should be and in our world, it should not just take into account what we're taking out and what's still there and what can be replaced and so on. It should really be looking at what we're taking out, what role did they serve in the ecosystem? Is that still being taken care of? It's not just the number of critters that we're removing, it's also the job that they do in that ecosystem. So that's how I look at sustainability and conservation. Really conservation, preservation, and restoration all kind of run hand in hand and depend on what state you're starting in, I think.
But I guess specifically to your field, right, and like what you do as a profession, right, with the management of herbivores, whatever, do you think that those words take on a little bit more of a nuance when you kind of look at it specifically within the stuff you're doing, or do you think the definition you kind of just gave fits pretty well?
Yeah, I think it still fits pretty well. With conservation, we're looking at using a native species to do the job that it normally does, just at an unnatural density, in a system that's lost quite a bit of its contemporary or complementary species. So essentially, we're conserving grazing function by introducing more of this native species to pick up the slack for what we've lost. So it really is restoration, but not of the species, of the function that they're providing. And then sustainability is, our reefs really can't sustain degradation at this rate. So we're doing everything that we can to arrest that decline and find a sustainable way of bringing it back into a functional coral reef ecosystem.
Do you have any more questions, Adolfho?
I was just thinking about tourists. What impact do they have in the corals? And because we have a big tourism industry over here.
Yes.
What can we do to mitigate that? Maybe people from going to the beach or stepping on them or diving or snorkeling. I have no idea.
Well, I think again, you guys are doing one of the most valuable components of that right here. Educating tourists as they come in to how delicate and delicate, important, and fascinating our coral reef critters are. Yes, I've definitely seen many tourists do minor damage to the reef, and it's not minor damage. Each one is doing minor damage, but you combine all of that over 12 months of the year, and it's a pretty substantial effect. But none of that, or none that I have seen, was malicious. It's not like they're doing it on purpose. It's ignorance, and not in a bad way. It's just someone from Kansas doesn't really know, or may not know what a coral reef is, and what is and isn't appropriate, or what is and isn't not appropriate, detrimental to a reef. So I think educating tourists and getting as much outreach as we can out there to kind of spread that word and awareness of what what we should and shouldn't do when we're visiting coral reefs, I think that will have the greatest effect.
All right.
And I guess the last question I'll ask you is, what do you, to anybody that's listening, right, what's kind of words of wisdom, any kind of last words you kind of want to tell people, what's your message to the world, I guess? No pressure.
Yeah, geez. I would say that we need to protect this resource, and restoration is, definitely a controversial field, but we can work towards restoration as a way forward with coral reef ecosystems into the future, or we can quit. So I'd prefer that we move towards restoration, and we've demonstrated in multiple different places around the world that it is effective, at the very least at slowing down the effects of climate change. But without restoration activities, there will be nothing to conserve or manage in the very near future. So I would just really emphasize the importance of restoration in habitats like coral reefs, especially on Florida's coral reef.
Absolutely. Well, I think that concludes the interview. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.